Hello, Christopher Hayes. You're professor in Fuller Theological Seminary, Pasadena, and you're professor of Ancient Near East Studies. And you're interested in the Bible, so you're combining Bible and Ancient Near Eastern studying, and I was very happy that you could come to Paris, to the Collège de France, and speak to us about divine suckling in the Hebrew Bible. So why divine suckling? Why is this important at all?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's such a pleasure to be in Paris with you. This is a topic that grew out of some of my past research on the book of Isaiah, and a particular passage in which the prophet seems to make fun of some of his contemporaries for seeking the help of a goddess. And one of the ways in which he mocks them is by portraying them as babies. Mm-hmm. And so I hypothesized and then attempted to show that there's a goddess named Mut, and she's one of these ancient Egyptian deities who's commonly portrayed as suckling pharaohs or other royalty in particular. So it's a very long-standing, powerful mythological motif, and I just found it a very striking example of the sort of intercultural connections that are sometimes underappreciated between the Bible and its ancient Near Eastern context. And of course, to be here in Paris, where you're currently working on ancient Egypt and the book of Joseph as a background is a real pleasure.
So this question of divine suckling is of course very intriguing. And what are the iconographic evidence you have, and can you describe a little bit what we can see on this evidence?
Sure. This goes back more than 5,000 years into ancient Egyptian iconography in particular, which seems to be the root from which various manifestations spring all over the ancient Near East later, although in smaller numbers. So in Egypt, what you have are various types of portrayals of goddesses breastfeeding or nursing, particularly pharaohs, but then also other people in the royal court, and it becomes perhaps a wider hope in later text. So you have a picture of the goddess sometimes standing, sometimes seated, sometimes in the form of a cow.
Right.
Actually,
that was my question. It's not always person. Like a woman.
Or a tree even with a breast. Right. It seems quite flexible, and in the syncretism of all these different goddesses, each of their characteristics sometimes comes out in the imagery. But then it's usually a human figure, whether it's nursing from a cow or a tree or a human form goddess. So and these run from the third millennium BC all the way through the Roman period. And in fact, then we even start to see, if I have time, I'll talk about this, that some of the Isis suckling Horus statuary looks just like the Mary suckling Jesus statuary. It's an almost seamless transition into even Christian imagery. So it appears to be a long-standing longing of the human heart or something.
Right. So you think this Egyptian influence in the Hebrew Bible, so taking the book of Isaiah as an example, so you think it's underestimated currently in research? Would you say it's more important than people commonly think for understanding the formation of the Hebrew Bible?
Yes, I do. I mean, you and I, of course, are of one mind about this, and we have some colleagues who are working on similar topics. But I think that our field in general, even over the past century or more, has tended to look more to Mesopotamia or the Ugarit or places like that to the north and east rather than south to Egypt. And partly I think it's a linguistic bias where things that are part of the same linguistic family feel like they must be more comparable to the Bible. However, when you look at the history of Israel and Judah with Egypt, you see this rich record of different kinds of contacts, some positive, some negative, but lots of cultural give and take. And I think because it's hard to identify linguistically in shared roots or shared texts, scholars have tended to overlook it. It's hard to teach. It's a whole other language and writing system to master. It's very challenging.
So you think they knew Egyptian in Jerusalem at 8th or 7th century BCE?
It's a fascinating question. There's very little record of any native Egyptian writing, though you do have hieratic numbers being used, of course, in ancient Judah. You also have some figurines, which I'll talk about during my talk, which have hieroglyphics sort of pressed into the back of the goddess figure. And so I suspect that probably most people who saw these figurines or even saw the numbers didn't think very much about their Egyptian background and probably couldn't even read them. But nonetheless, they were sort of in the water, in the air that they breathed. And it was a much smaller world than I think many people out there on the street might think. These cultures were not hermetically sealed to themselves.
From Egypt or so, right. So it's like today, we hear so much American influence and people not always know where it comes from. I don't want to speak about food and so, but it's I think it's a little bit the same. The other important thing in your research is also to emphasize the role of goddesses, and this is something also, I don't know how you feel about this question of worshipping goddesses in early Israel or Judah in the first part of the first millennium BCE. So you have any ideas about that? Or
this is one of the big questions, and I've valued your work on the topic very much, having just read your new book, The Invention of God. And I think that we all have a sense that probably goddess worship was even more widespread than some strata of the Bible might suggest, and that on the street or in private homes or in even perhaps more public ways that goddesses probably were venerated. And the question is, how do we reconstruct the picture, and who did they think that those goddesses were? Mm-hmm. That's a question that this talk will take on, because you have such syncretism, such combination, both in Egypt and elsewhere in the Levant, with all these different goddesses, Asherah, Anat, Aterat, all these different names for similar deities, and so who might they have called the Queen of Heaven? Who was that in Jeremiah 44? And so I'm trying to make a case for a goddess Mut who's not often talked about with respect to the Bible.
So you think the Queen of Heaven could be this goddess Mut?
Well, I've looked at that with one of my students in the past who wrote a seminar paper on the topic, and I can't make the case for the book of Jeremiah, but for the book of Isaiah, this is this Hebrew phrase, the covenant with death. Right. And that Hebrew word death is maut, right? And maut sounds very much like Mut, especially as it was probably pronounced
very fair, yes,
at the time. So I think that there I can make a case that she's being called that. But I suspect that they probably used different names at different times, and that there was no one identity, probably.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's so much syncretism, and so maybe Queen of Heaven is also a convenient way to speak about a deity which can be called Asherah, yes, or Mut or Anat, or because if you go to the south of Elephantine, then we have Anat in the 5th century, so which is also showing that there's influence from the Levant going to Egypt. It's not just one way, I think. So.
And Hathor, of course, also seems to have had central cults in both places. So, yeah. So I mean, so there's so much to do there, and not going to solve all that here. But this is one more piece of a larger puzzle.
The question of the goddess is, of course, also very intriguing, because at one time there will be a kind of a monotheism where there's only one God. Yeah. And does this God still have a gender, sexuality, or how do you see because in the normal system you have male gods, you have female gods, and then how you think it is possible to get lost of this differentiation and just have one God?
Yes, well, as you know, this is one of the great complex questions of the history of the Old Testament and its formation and the thoughts that go into it. I mean, of course, we can watch the process of the definition of Yahweh first, if you will, taking on the characteristics of other deities, and then some of those being later excluded from the true identity of God as the authors of the Bible perceived it. So what I'm arguing here in this talk is that the divine wet nurse image is one that is first condemned by Isaiah, and in fact may have been successfully done, since there's no native form imagery in the Levant in this time period. However, when you look at the later strata of the Bible, things like in 3rd Isaiah, Odes of Solomon, New Testament text, there it comes back again in force, and suddenly God is, I mean, God the Lord of Israel is suddenly kind of nursing again, and so it's the kind of thing that you can try to beat back, but it never goes away.
So if you're doing a little bit like gender studies, you would say that you cannot get rid of totally of this question of male, female images, even if it's the one God. He still needs, in a way, to integrate the functions of the goddesses and of the male gods.
Sure. And you know, and the current, for example, Catholic veneration of Mary is I think one more later manifestation of that same urge. So yes, very, very long standing in the human heart.
And it's interesting that we spoke about the goddess of heaven, or the the queen of heaven, and this was a title, in fact, that was given to Mary in the Middle Ages. So they were probably not aware of the ancient Near East, but still there's a continuity, I think.
That's
absolutely.
amazing,
So thank you so much for being here in Paris and sharing your ideas, and we are all looking forward to your next research, your next book, and thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.